Sunday morning, I had a debacle at the very beginning of class, and then my explanation of the debacle made everything a lot worse. So basically, I've been trying to lose weight. And as of 10 days ago, I hit my goal weight. But that afternoon, I got sick. And so for 10 days now, I really haven't eaten. I haven't had any meals or anything. I've had just a little bit of protein, but not much. Hopefully tomorrow will be the day that I eat again. So the good thing was it helped me lose even more weight. So I beat my goal by a few more pounds, but for the last 10 days, I haven't been feeling up to par. And so Sunday, my brain wasn't there. Sometimes when you're sick and you haven't eaten right, your brain just isn't working the way that it's supposed to. And so I printed out the wrong notes. And so I apologize for that. Hopefully today will be better. So what we've been doing, studying the book of Hebrews, in this book, I introduced us to an analogy or an example that makes sense to me, and a few people said it made sense to them. It's like you figure this whole Old Testament system is like a ball full of a whole bunch of different strings. And those strings are interconnected. So throughout the course of the study or his writing of this book or the sermon that he gave, what he's doing is he's pulling on some of these strings. And as he pulls on some of these strings, other strings begin to loosen up a little bit, and then he might leave that string and start pulling on another string, and you can see how much all these things are related. So some of the different elements that he's been talking about so far, you look at Jesus being the king or the high priest, you look at the Levitical priesthood, the covenant, the promises, the mediators, the intercessions, a two-room tabernacle, or sacrifices, blood, altars, a veil. I mean, you just throw it all in there. And one of the things he's showing that if you're able to pull one of those strings out and show that the system itself communicated that that particular element was never supposed to last forever. It was supposed to come to an end. It was supposed to do what God wanted it to do, but it wasn't part or the end of what God's ultimate goal was. And if you could get one of those strings pulled out, you'll see all these other strings start to follow, and the ball will fall apart. You'll say, there is no Old Testament law or Old Testament system to go back to. So most recently, he was talking about the priesthood. And he makes these arguments that if the Levitical priesthood was able to accomplish God's eternal plan, it accomplished what God wanted to accomplish, but it was never supposed to be the end accomplishment. Does that make sense? And in the system, he says that. He goes, if it wasn't true, then why in the world would David talk about a high priest to come after the order of Melchizedek? You just scratch your head a little bit. Yeah, if the Levitical priesthood was all that it was supposed to be, and it was supposed to, all that God wanted accomplished was supposed to be done through the Levitical priesthood, then no really need to have a priest arise according to the order of Melchizedek. And he makes the point, if there's a new priesthood, then what else is there has to be a new of? Has to be a new law. And if there's a new priesthood, there's got to be a different sanctuary, and there's got to be a different covenant. And so all those things are just wrapped up together. And then in chapter 8, he continued that high priest conversation. And then he switched, or he sort of stopped pulling on the high priest string for a while, and he switched to the covenant string. And in order to talk a little bit about the covenant, he said, if the old covenant was all God ever intended, and it was going to accomplish his eternal purpose, then why did Jeremiah talk about a new covenant and how this new covenant was going to be different than the old covenant in a very major way? The old covenant was an outside-in type of a covenant. In other words, you became a part of that covenant, not by choice. You became a part of that covenant by birth. And on day 8, the males were circumcised as a sign of that covenant. And then what had to happen? The rest of their life, or at least a good portion of their childhood, they had to be taught the law. They had to be taught what this covenant was all about, because they didn't make that conscious decision to be part of that. It was sort of an outside-in concept. Where the new covenant is different. When we come into the new covenant, it's by our choice. And there's been a lot of heart changes before we even enter the covenant. Because we've come to believe that Jesus is the Christ. He is the high priest. He is the sacrifice. He is the one that has made the ultimate purpose that God had on this earth, drawing us near to Him, possible. And we've repented. We changed, right? Our life has already changed. And so when we became part of that covenant, a lot of God's law was already written on our heart because we made decisions to follow after Him. And so it's more of an inside-out type of a covenant where the teaching is a lot different. Well, as we get into chapter 9, he's really going to have all these different elements now talking about them almost simultaneously. He's talking about the priesthood, he's talking about the sanctuary, he's talking about the covenant, and we see that these are so intertwined that they can't be separated. They accomplished exactly what God wanted them to accomplish, and He never intended for them to accomplish His ultimate purpose. His ultimate purpose was always supposed to be accomplished through His Son, who is the perfect high priest. Does that make sense? All right, so chapter 9, let's read verses 1 through 10. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 10. Then indeed, even the first covenant, so notice covenant, sanctuary, notice high priest might be mentioned a little bit later. Then indeed, even the first covenant had ordinances of divine service and the earthly sanctuary, for a tabernacle was prepared. The first part, in which was the lampstand, the table, the showbread, which is called the sanctuary, and behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid on all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot that had the manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. And above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. Verse 6. Now when these things had been thus prepared, the priest always went into the first part of the tabernacle, performing the services. But in the second part of the priest went alone, the high priest went alone once a year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the people's sins in ignorance. The Holy Spirit indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. It was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience, concerned only with the food and drinks, various washings, and fleshly ordinances imposed until the day of Reformation. So our first question that I asked you to think about for tonight was, what were the two main rooms in the tabernacle and what separated them? It's pretty simple, but we're going to talk about it in a little more detail. So this is like low-hanging fruit. If you want to raise your hand and answer this one, you are welcome to raise your hand and answer this one. All right, Debbie's got a response.
The lampstand, the table, and the showbread is one. Is that correct?
Okay, that is the items, which is the next question.
Oh,
So
they were separated by a veil.
All right, they're separated by a veil. And so
Yeah.
what were the two things? What was the first room called?
Sanctuary.
The sanctuary or the holy place. And then on the other side of the veil was the most holy place. And that was the way that the tabernacle was set up. Now, there's a couple things in here that I think is worth mentioning. One is that in this text, he actually says, instead of there were two rooms, he actually says there are two tabernacles. So the first tabernacle and the second tabernacle, and he's probably just using that as an illustration of one had this function and the other had this function. Now, if you go back, I went back and did this. If you look at the tabernacle itself, there was the coverings of the tabernacle, there wasn't a distinct separation in those two. The thing that separated them was that veil. And so that's an important thing to consider. Now, what were some of the things in each room? The first room. Somebody tell me, what was in the first room? All right, you had the lampstand, which if you're entering the tabernacle, where's the lampstand? Up on the ceiling? On the right, to the left? Straight ahead. Right in the left. It's in the left. The lampstand is on the left. What's on the right? Table of showbread. All right, so that is on the right. And that is what he mentions that is in that section. The lampstand. What's the lampstand really represent? You're going to say, what would be what would it mean to represent to the people? Glory of God, the direction of God. I think all those things. What about the showbread? What would it represent? God's provisions. All right. So in that you have those representations as the high priest or as the priest go into that first section of the tabernacle. Now, I think it's important to understand. No, we mentioned this over and over and over again. This is an earthly sanctuary. Right? This is an earthly tabernacle. And this is how God designed it to be set up. It was built according to the pattern that was shown Moses on the mountain. Now, what is in the list as being in the holiest or the most holy place?
The Ark of the Covenant.
All right. The Ark of the Covenant. What else? Let's talk, and then we'll mention them out, and then we'll talk about them. The golden altar of incense. What else? And some things he sort of describes some of this stuff. How does he describe some of these things? You have the golden pot inside the ark. What do you have inside the ark? The golden pot. What was in the golden pot? Manna. What else do you have in there?
Aaron's staff that budded.
Aaron's rod that budded, and so now what he doesn't mention that was supposed to be beside the Ark of the Covenant as well was Moses' copy of the law. If you remember, that's the copy that they found under the time of Josiah, probably. So that was also would have been in the most holy spot. So what is the significance of the manna? I think it's God's provisions, but more of His miraculous provisions. You know, the showbread is reminiscent or reminds us of God's natural provision for the people. I mean, He gives us the seed, He lets it to grow, all the stuff that goes with that, and that symbolizes that. But the manna, that was different. That was God's miraculous provisions that happened, and they needed to be reminded that God took care of them that way. Now, it's also extremely interesting to talk about Aaron's rod that was there. What was the story behind Aaron's rod budding? It happened right after Korah's rebellion. Remember, right after Korah's rebellion, and then Korah dies. The people that didn't move away from the tent fast enough, and the two other guys associated with him, the one other guy, his wife probably taught him better. He didn't take part in that. So all their tents were swallowed up, and they died. And anybody that didn't get far enough away, they also died. Well, the next day, what happens to people? You think the people are like, boy, we are sure glad that we have rid ourselves of those evil people. What did the people come to Moses and do? Complained, you killed them. Moses, you killed those people. And so God's upset with them, and so he says to get a staff from each of the tribes, Aaron's staff, write Aaron's name on it. Everybody's going to write their names on it so we know. Puts it into the tabernacle, and the next day, Aaron's rod is budding, right? And all the way have full-grown almonds on it. Pretty significant. Now, what was that to prove to the people? Say again? Aaron was chosen. And Aaron was a descendant of Levi. So it's interesting here in Hebrews where he's making the point that the Levitical priesthood was chosen, but it wasn't chosen forever because there was going to rise a priest under the order of Melchizedek. But in the middle of that, he notes Aaron's rod that was budding being part of what was there. And I find that very fascinating that he would do that. And I think it does sort of lend to the fact that, hey, it accomplished everything it was supposed to accomplish. It didn't fail. It accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish when it was all said and done. And then he talks about the tablets of the covenant. Now he's talking about covenants, right? The tablet of the covenant. It's the ark of the covenant that is in there, and it's the mercy seat. Now, Did you notice that something's out of place? Something is not where it's supposed to be. Debbie's like, no, that can't be right. Yeah, the altar of incense. In the Old Testament description, let's look at Exodus. Let's look at Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 10. Exodus 30, 1 through 10. Man, my mic runners have nothing to do. I'm sorry, mic runners. Anybody want to read Exodus 31 to 1 through 10 so that we can get Emery moving? He can come bring you a microphone. All right. Alan over here. Oh, yes, on the wrong side. Mike's bring it up here to Mike. We didn't get the right guy moving. Exodus 30, 1 through 10, Mike.
31, 1 through 10.
30, 1 through 10.
Oh, 30. Oh, sorry. Nope. Oh, there. And thou shalt make an altar to burn incense upon. Of shittim wood thou shalt make it. A cubit shall be the length thereof, and a cubit the breadth thereof. 4 shall it be, and 2 cubits shall be the height thereof. The horns thereof shall be of the same. And thou shalt overlay it with pure gold, the top thereof, and the sides thereof round about, and the horns thereof, and thou shalt make unto it a crown of gold round about. And the 2 golden rings shalt thou make to it under the crown of it, by the 2 corners thereof, and upon the 2 sides of it thou shalt make it. And they shall be the places for the staves to bear it withal. And thou shalt make staves of shittim wood, and overlay them with gold. And thou shalt put it before the veil, that is the veil of the testimony, before the mercy seat that is over the testimony, where I shall meet with thee. And Aaron shall burn thereon sweet incense every morning, when he dresses the lamps and burns incense upon it. And when Aaron lighteth the lamps at even, he shall burn incense upon it, a perpetual incense before the Lord, throughout your generations. You shall offer no strange incense thereof, nor burnt offering, nor meat offering, neither shall you pour drink offering thereon. And Aaron shall make an atonement upon the blood horns of it once in a year with the blood of the sin offering of atonement. Once in the year shall he make atonement upon it throughout your generations. It is most holy to the Lord.
All right, so it describes this altar of incense as being in the holy place before you get to the veil. And the Hebrew writer talks about it being in the most holy place. Any explanation for that? The Hebrew writer didn't know quite as much about the Old Testament as we thought, huh? There's this mess up here. A typo? No, nobody proofread his work. There's a couple options. One is it's a matter of just, he's describing it based upon the function. And the function of that particular piece of furniture was to be in the presence of God and to take the people's prayers to God. The other possibility is it was really partly in both rooms. So because it couldn't, why could not the whole altar be in the most holy place? All right, Joy has an answer. There we go. We got Emery moving now.
Because the high priest could only go into the most holy place once a year. So if the altar of incense was in there, he would be going in there more.
Yeah, if the whole altar of incense was in the Holy of Holy Places, and that's where they went in every day to offer, and it's not just the high priest, Joy. Who offered the incense on the altar of incense every day? Was it always only the high priest? No, it was other priests did that. As a matter of fact, the most famous one probably from our perspective is Zacharias. When he sees the angel who tells him he's going to be the father of John the Baptist. He's in the holy place burning incense on the altar of incense. Now, The incense then would travel into the Holy of Holy Place as a memorial. It represented the prayers that eventually went up to God. So I think there is a sense in which it was, at least the function was both. It had to be offered or laid in the holy place, but it was intended for what was offered on there to enter the holy place holiest place, because that's where God was. And so it could be function, or it could be, you know what? It's sort of on the borderline here. It works in both places. Is a possibility that goes with that. Let me ask you this. So what in all this? So what's the point in all of him bringing up all this furniture? It's not really a lesson in what's taking place here as far as how the tabernacle is designed. That's not his point. He doesn't want to make sure his readers know all this stuff. They figured they probably already know. What's his point? What's he doing here? Anybody have any thoughts? What do we say about the old covenant? What kind of covenant was it? Inside out, outside in? Outside in. I think one of the things he's doing is trying to emphasize the physical aspect of that old covenant. Look at all this, and he's going to talk about it a little bit later as far as just all the washings of the body and taking care of all these specific commands. So much of it was physical, and he wanted to remind them about how this was a physical part of what it was talking about. And the covenant started, think about this. Now, in one sense, the covenant started with Abraham. But wasn't there another sense in which the covenant started nationally after he brought him out of Egypt? That's where the ratifying deal. And they say, we're going to do everything God tells us to do, right? So this is a very special... When that started at Mount Sinai and God gave the Ten Commandments directly to the people, this is the covenant, what was the people's response? We'll do it. But when they heard God's voice, say the words.
They didn't want to talk to God.
They didn't want to hear God's voice.
They didn't want God talking to them.
So, if God's eternal purpose is for him and man to draw near to each other, even the start of that was not a good start, was it? In other words, Moses, you go. And the whole design of the tabernacle is set up to remind you that you can't get close to God. Because who are the only people that can go into the holy place? Can I go in the holy place if I were a Jew? The holy place, priests could go in there. The priests could go in there. But the veil of the front, that kept everybody else out. So if I'm not a priest, I can go to where the bronze altar is. I can go to where they're making the sacrifice, and I bring my lamb there. But as far as going in there, I can't go. Only the priest can go. And who can only go into the most holy place is the high priest. And how often could the high priest go into the most holy place? Once a year. And I heard somebody estimate that took about 2 minutes. I don't know if that was true or not, but it wasn't for very long. And so you're going in, and that was the best access that they could have under the old covenant. That was the access to God. And I think him bringing this up, is that really what you want to go back to? Is that really what you want to go back to? The separation from God by all these veils and curtains and rooms, and not as close direct access to God as we would want to have. And I think that's one of the main things there. So before Randy's comment, I'll open something else up. Why doesn't he use the temple? I mean, at this point, if this is written before 70 AD, at least the temple is still standing. Why does he go back to the tabernacle? Why doesn't he talk about the temple? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
The Ark of the
Yes, and I think he can go back to the tabernacle because the temple was already corrupted and it was missing a bunch of stuff. Primarily, it's missing the Ark of the Covenant. They have a stone sitting in its place of the Ark of the Covenant. So no Ark of the Covenant is there. If the Ark of the Covenant's not there, what else isn't there? God. Who else is there is God. But all those things that go in the Ark of the Covenant, and they were sort of missing from scattered about, Aaron's rod, when did it become missing? The manna, when did it become missing? So in Solomon's temple, there was the ark, but all this other stuff was missing. Not all of it was there. So I think it does show, when using the tabernacle, it shows that all this stuff is temporary, and you can't even keep up with it anyway. And so it's fleeting. The other thing is, it does sort of make sense to go back to the tabernacle because the whole system is going back to the tabernacle, and that's where the pattern is, instead of hitting the temple. All right, Randy?
Yeah, I was just going to say the reason he's doing this in the first 10 verses is the same thing he's done previously with priesthood and other things. He's setting up a huge contrast between the old and what's now with Christ, the new covenant.
Yeah. So he's going to set a huge contrast, and he's going to come back to that he's going to come to that in just a few minutes. All right, any thoughts about where we are so far? So he's laid out this earthly tabernacle, temporary, did exactly what God wanted to do as long as the people were following God correctly, but it was never meant to be permanent. There was always going to be another sanctuary. And it's just a copy, it's a replica, it is a shadow, it is built according to the pattern of the real sanctuary. That's where? In heaven. It's a huge contrast. Remember, things in heaven are better than things on earth. So Jesus is ministering in heaven. That's better than a priest is ministering on this earth. All right, so let's, I think we've already talked a little bit about the next question. It's not advancing for me here. Go to the next question. I think we've already passed the next question. All right, so which priest could go into the first room? All of them, whoever had that, the lot was cast to who got to do what. And they did that twice a day, as what the passage that we just read, morning and evening. They would offer these sacrifices up. And then the only one that can go into the most holy places is the high priest. Now, I do have a little diagram here. Hopefully you can see this a little bit better. And so you see that when you enter in, on the left is the menorah, right, showbread. They have the altar of incense in the holy place, and you have the veil, and then you have the most holy place that was there. We talked a lot about this last year when we did the book of Exodus. So we come to asking about, let's read verses 11 through 15. 11 through 15. I'll go ahead and read it. But Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. Not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? And for this reason he is the mediator of the new covenant, by means of death, for the redemption of the transgression under the first covenant, and those who are called may receive the promise of eternal inheritance. So, question number 4 there. How is Christ's service in his sanctuary superior to the Levitical priesthood, sort of what Randy was mentioning, to service in their sanctuary? Now, you guys ought to have a few things for this. So raise your hand. I got Debbie. We got Jeff. We got Joe. All right, Jeff, we'll let you go first. Just give us 1 or 2 at the most.
Okay. First of all, he entered into the holy place through his blood rather than the blood of animals.
Okay. What's significant about that? Not Jeff can answer that, or somebody else can answer that. What is significant about that? Entering to the holy place, which what holy place are we talking about here? Where is it? It's in heaven. He enters in. Let me ask you this. How many perfect, without spot, without blemish, animal sacrifices do you think had been offered to God throughout the course of history? More than 10?
Perfect.
Without blemish, that satisfied the requirement of being spotless and blemish, without blemish. Hundreds of thousands, maybe, at least tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands throughout the whole history. All those lambs were classified as being spotless and without blemish. They had to be, and they were inspected in order to be offered up to God. How many humans were spotless and without blemish? Well, one, Christ. Right, Jesus, right? Now we know that Jesus is God too, but that's it. You see the huge contrast there? It's just all these, and when Jesus was alive, how many animals could they go get that didn't have blemishes? All the time. They were offering sacrifices all the time. But this huge difference, he is the only blameless person. Now, how many animal sacrifices had been offered through the years? Hundreds of thousands? How many people, a human being, had been sacrificed for God? Just Jesus. Just one. Huge difference. Huge difference. Not to mention that the one is also God's Son.
And it was
okay, you and then Debbie needs a microphone up here. John, Debbie needs a microphone up here.
also is just one time.
Yeah, one time. You want to contrast that to the old law?
Well, the old law, it's sort of the same. They had to do it over and over and over and over. They had several high priests. Any way you look at it, it was a multiplicity. Here is one time,
Okay.
and it was forever. They didn't have to do it again.
Yeah, and he sort of pulled on that string before, which he talked about the physical priest had to go in and offer these sacrifices continually. They had to offer from themselves. They had to offer for the people. But Jesus, when he offered his own blood, it was one time. He didn't have to offer it all the time. And he didn't have to offer it for himself because he didn't sin. And so that's a huge difference. Debbie?
The first covenant was man-made. The second one was not man-made. It was made by God.
Okay.
And the first one was temporal, and the second one was eternal.
Okay. So you have temporary, permanent. The first one sanctuary made by man, the other sanctuary made by God. Brian?
Well, all those offerings in the Old Testament, the way he puts it is they cleanse the flesh. But Jesus actually cleansed the conscience. So it was like God created a way to visually show them sin and to present sin as sort of like an external sort of defilement. And the washings and stuff cleansed them externally so they could approach God. But the real problem was internal, and only Christ could deal with that, not the physical washings and sacrifices.
Yeah, so the Old Testament system really was designed to show what sin did and how to get rid of the sin by blood, but it was never intended, or really very seldom reached someone's heart the way God intended. Ideally it would, right? Ideally, you're born into the Jewish system, you're circumcised on the 8th day, your parents teach you everything, and that hits your heart, and you realize, I want to be part of this covenant. I'm glad I'm part of this covenant. But it rarely happened that way. And that is, if you go back to chapter 8 and look at verse 12, after he quoted from Jeremiah 31 through 34, and verse 12, he says, "For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more." We've said this before, that the most important thing when he quotes a passage from the Old Testament is the last thing he quotes. And that's the last thing he quotes. that in that new covenant, there is going to be forgiveness. In a different sense, complete forgiveness. Now, the Old Testament, there was a way to forgive sins. It wasn't permanent, and it wasn't going to be the ultimate solution to forgive sins. But if they did what God wanted them to do, their sins were in fact forgiven. But it wasn't until Christ came that they could be totally forgiven the way that God wanted them to be forgiven. All right, you have anything else? Eternal, final, once for all. All right, Joe has something else?
Well, I was going to say eternal, but you said that. But through Christ, once you're, just like you quoted just from chapter 8, once you're in Christ, you're in Christ. You don't have to keep going back and going back with a lamb and a lamb and a lamb over and over and over.
All right, good. So let's just make sure that we understand where we are and what he's doing. He is making sure that they understand that the old covenant, the old law, did what God wanted it to do, but he never intended for it to be permanent. Written inside the law itself is evidence of that. And that's why he's going back to show, why would someone talk about a new covenant of the old covenant? Why would he talk about new priesthood? There's old priesthood there. And in this particular section, he is pointing out that there's one thing that the old law and the system could never do, that the new system could do, and that is an internal washing. The old system was great at the external, and that was the focus of all those rituals and all those hand washings and all those sacrifices and all the physical tabernacle, the physical this, the physical that. And he says, do you really want to go back to that? Or do you want to stay with God's Son, who came blameless, perfect, high priest, was the high priest and was the sacrifice, and instead of going into the most holy place made with hands, has gone into heaven and offered up his own blood one time that totally cleanses us from our sins, and it cleanses us our heart so that we want to serve him and be part of this covenant. What do you want to choose? And that's the point that he's making. And as he's using pulling all these strings, if one falls, they all fall. And they're all falling together. And what's going to happen over the next couple chapters is he's going to keep pulling on these strings until everybody's got to come to the conclusion, I don't want to go back. I want to stick with what we have. And at the end of chapter 8, I noted last time, at the end of chapter 8, I think he is also getting them prepared, because what's going to happen to all these physical things in 70 AD? Now, what if you were a Jew, a Christian Jew at that time, and you were trying to hold on to both, and you hadn't been forewarned a little bit? I think this is a good forewarning for them. It really is. It's say, you know what? These physical things were never meant to say. So if I'm telling you, these physical things were never meant to last forever, and they're destroyed, how does that affect you? As opposed, if you've never heard that before, you thought they were supposed to last forever. It's going to be a lot easier, right? It's going to be a lot easier. Oh, yeah, this is what the Old Testament was talking about. All these things that the Hebrew writers told us about, we should expect all this to happen. And if they go away, it's no big deal anyway. They couldn't cleanse us like we need to be cleansed. All right, thank you, everybody. Joe has questions for you for Wednesday in the back there. So make sure you pick up a copy of the questions for Sunday, not Wednesday.